Welcome back, class. I hope you all had a very good summer. I had a good summer. I hope you all rested and you're ready to get to work this year. As we're going to be talking about the 1900s to the 1920s in our first unit. So we're going to talk about the Wright brothers today. We're going to talk about the Panama Canal. We're going to talk about women's rights, women's suffrage. We're going to talk about prohibition. We're going to talk about the World War I in this unit. So all this going on. Then we're going to talk about at the end of it. We're going to get into the Great Depression afterwards, but with our second unit. But today we are talking about the Wright brothers. And what did the Wright brothers do? The Wright brothers were the first to invent an airplane and have a successful flight. All right, in 1903 they did this, and they came back. It was a pair of brothers, and that's who we're talking about today. So, who were they? There was Orville and Wilbur Wright. They're credited with inventing the airplane, and like I said, they made the first successful human flight with a craft that was powered by an engine and heavier than air.
Orville and Wilbur Wright. Orville and Wilbur Wright are credited with inventing the airplane. They were first to make a successful human flight with a craft that was powered by an engine and was heavier than the air.
All right. So it was quite a milestone. It impacted transportation throughout the world. All right. Just 20, 30 years later, there was commercial airlines. There were industrial airlines. There's all kinds of stuff going on 20 or 30 years later, just after they had made the first successful flight. So it enabled people to travel these distances much faster. Before then, you had the train, which we talked about the train at the end of last year, or the Transcontinental Railroad. And it enabled them to make these trips a lot faster. You know, it took a week or so to get across the United States in a train. Well, you could get there in hours in an airplane. All right. You had to go all the way around the southern tip of, before the Panama Canal was built, in a boat. You had to go all the way around. If you want to get from one side of the United States to the other by boat, you had to go all the way down the tip of South America and come back up. So it enabled people to travel faster.
A milestone. This was quite a milestone and impacted transportation throughout the world. It took some time to perfect, but in later years, people could travel large distances at much less time. Today, trips that previously would have taken months by boat and train can now be traveled by plane in a few hours.
All right. So where did the two brothers grow up? Where did Orville and Wilbur grow up? Well, Wilbur was the older brother. All right. He was about 4 years older than Orville. He was born in 1867, and Orville was born in 1871. Wilbur was born in Millville, Indiana. All right. And then Orville was born in Dayton, Ohio. So, and they traveled back and forth between Indiana and Ohio a lot during their childhood. And they had 5 other siblings, 5 other brothers and sisters. So Indiana and Ohio is where they were born.
Where did the Wright brothers grow up? Wilbur was the older brother by about 4 years. He was born in Millville, Indiana on April 16th, 1867. Orville was born in Dayton, Ohio on August 19th, 1871. They grew up in Indiana and Ohio, moving back and forth a few times with their family. They had 5 other siblings.
On another note, because Ohio says they were the birthplace of aviation, well, the very first flight took place in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. So what does North Carolina's license plate say? It says first in flight. So there's an argument there about who was really the first in flight. All right. Well, I can settle that argument for you. They grew up in Indiana and Ohio. That's where they were born. All right. But the first flight was in North Carolina. So they both kind of own rights to birthplace of aviation and first in flight. So, all right. So they grew up and they loved to invent things. All right. They loved it. And they got interested in flying when their dad gave them a toy helicopter. All right. And it flew with the help of rubber bands. And they experimented in making their own helicopters. And Orville liked building kites as well. So they were inventors. All right. And they got the very first time when they got interested was when they had this toy helicopter. And that's what the toy helicopter would have looked like back then.
Growing up continued. The boys grew up loving to invent things. They got interested interested in flying when their dad gave them a toy helicopter that flew with the help of rubber bands. They experimented with making their own helicopters, and Orville liked to build kites.
All right, so who flew this first flight? Orville made the famous first flight. He's the younger brother. All right. The first flight took place at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. So that's why North Carolina says on their license plate, it says first in flight. All right. On December 17th, 1903, they chose Kitty Hawk because, first of all, it had a hill. Next, it had very good wind, good breezes. All right. And it was sandy. So if they crashed, the impact wouldn't be as bad. It would soften the landings. And that very first flight that Orville flew, it lasted 12 seconds, and it flew 120 feet, all right? And each brother that day made other flights, but that was the very first flight. Very first flight was 12 seconds, 120 feet. That's what they flew.
Who flew the first flight? Orville made the famous first flight. The flight took place at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina on December 17th, 1903. They chose Kitty Hawk because it had a hill, good breezes, and was sandy, which would help soften the landings in case of a crash. The first flight lasted 12 seconds, and they flew for 120 feet. Each brother made additional flights that were slightly longer.
All right. So it wasn't an easy task. They had years of experimenting and preparation for this, okay? They had to learn how to make efficient propellers. They had to do a lightweight engine for the powered flight, okay? Because they didn't want it to be too heavy, otherwise it wouldn't get off the ground. And there was a lot of technology that went into that first flight.
First flight continued. This wasn't a simple or easy task that they had completed. They had worked and experimented for years with gliders, perfecting the wing designs and controls. Then they had to learn how to make efficient propellers and a lightweight engine for powered flight. There was a lot of technology, know-how, and courage involved in making that first flight.
All right. So the next year, 1904, they came back. They took their newly designed airplane, which was called the Flyer 2, all right? And it lasted, they took it up for a flight, and it lasted 5 minutes. So it went from 12 seconds being that first flight to 5 minutes the next year with a different aircraft called the Flyer 2 that they made improvements from the first aircraft, all right? They made improvements to it. They made it better. And it lasted about 5 minutes. So that's a long time compared to the 12-second run that they had their very first run.
The Flyer 2. The Wright brothers didn't stop with this first flight. They continued to perfect their craft. Around a year later, in November 1904, Wilbur took their newly designed airplane, the Flyer 2, to the air for the first flight lasting over 5 minutes.
All right, so did they invent anything else? Well, their primary thing that they invented was the first airplane, all right? They were pioneers in the areas of flight, all right? That's what they were. They did own a successful bicycle shop. They ran a printing press before their flight, all right? And but their primary thing that they worked on was flight, was the airplane, the very first airplane, and then making improvements to that very first airplane. So they did invent some things, but mainly that's the most famous thing that they're known for.
Did the Wright brothers invent anything else? The Wright brothers were primarily pioneers in the area of flight. They did a lot of work on aerodynamics, propellers, and wing design. Prior to working on flight, they ran a printing press business and then later a successful bicycle shop.
All right. So who invented the first airplane? I've said their name many times today. Was it A, Alberto Santos Dumont, B, Orville and Wilbur Wright, or C, Mr. Betts? It was B, Orville and Wilbur Wright.
Ding, ding, ding.
Orville and Wilbur Wright, two brothers. Orville made the very first flight. The younger brother did. All right, number two, where were the brothers born? Were they born in A, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, B, California, or C, Millville, Indiana, and Dayton, Ohio? I don't have Dayton, Ohio on here, but where were the brothers born? They were born in Millville, Indiana, and Dayton, Ohio. All right. Wilbur was born in Millville, Indiana, and Orville was born in Dayton, Ohio 4 years later.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number three, what did they fly as kids? What got them interested in these flights? What did their dad give them? A toy airplane, B, a toy helicopter, or C, did they fly with Superman? Their dad gave them a toy helicopter. Okay, and when he got this toy helicopter, they began interested. They said, "Hey, how's this thing work? We want to know how it is." So they started trying to invent helicopters themselves.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number 4, where was the first flight? Was it in A, California, B, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, or C, Millville, Indiana? It was in B, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, right here. That's why North Carolina on their license plate has first in flight, and they have a disagreement with Ohio, where Orville was born in Dayton, Ohio, and that's where they lived a lot of times. And so, but their very first flight was in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
And number 5, what did they do in 1904? A, they flew the Flyer 2 over 5 minutes after that first flight. B, nothing. Or C, they invented the Spruce Goose. It is A, they flew the Flyer 2 the next year after they flew the first flight for 12 seconds. They flew the Flyer 2 after they made improvements to it for 5 minutes long.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
And that is all for today with Orville and Wilbur Wright. We'll be back tomorrow or next time with the Panama Canal. And we're going to dive deeper into the 1900s through the 1920s. We've got lots of stuff to cover. And I will see you all then.